This is the Cortex Athletic Review. I'm your host, Evan Carrillo, and each week I dive into the research to distill and relate sports science and psychological peer-reviewed literature to modern-day coaching and athletic development with a slight bias to hockey goaltenders. On April 1st, 2026, we got a new mission to the moon. A mission called Artemis 2 launched from the Kennedy Space Center, and it's been pretty cool to watch the launch and see live updates from the astronauts as they loop around the Earth and the moon and then all the way back to Earth. One of those updates was an exercise update from astronaut Victor Glover. I learned that for the astronauts, the workouts aren't so much about making gains or keeping weight off. When orbiting the Earth, for example, they're not quite in zero G, but what's called a microgravity environment, moving fast enough that they're in a constant state of freefall, so everything appears mostly weightless. The thing about the human body is the systems within it are expensive to run. If the body doesn't need something, energy to maintain it gets throttled back or shut off. Because of this load-dependent nature, if the load, like gravity, is just removed, the body pretty quickly starts adapting, and in some cases, this might mean deleting tissue. One of the great redundancies in nature is that the body sheds what it doesn't need. Muscle, ligaments, bone density, these are all metabolically expensive tissues to run. Maintaining them takes constant stimulus, and if that stimulus isn't there, the body just sheds it to reduce that metabolic load. In these space programs, where astronauts are not constantly working to stay upright against gravity, they typically show losses in the quads, the calves, and spinal stabilizing muscles. Some atrophy can start in as little as 24 to 48 hours, with more measurable decline after about 5 to 7 days. Even if you don't do any formal training on Earth, like you're not actively working out, you're not an active athlete, you're still contending with gravity. Most major muscles in your body are constantly active just to keep you upright. There's more physiological weirdness reported when astronauts return from space, but you can think of that as kind of a regression. Muscle, bone density, and nervous system input all trending in reverse and needing to be rebuilt again. When rebuilding those systems, the primary tool is often resistance training. For the longest time, there's been a convention that kids under a certain age should just stay away from weights and stick to bodyweight exercises because of concerns often cited like stunted growth or damage to growth plates. That's what I wanted to address in this episode. The idea that pre-adolescents should just stay away from resistance training and what the research over the last 20 years actually says about that. So my model up to now with these episodes is to take one article per week and distill it as best I can through a narrative and present it in spoken podcast form, not so much to serve as the answer to some of these concepts in athletic development and performance, but to just get more of the research out there and accessible. I am breaking from that convention a little bit this week and including 2 different articles, but the focus is on a 2016 study called Effects of Resistance Training in Youth Athletes on Muscular Fitness and Athletic Performance. It was written by Urs Granicher and colleagues and published in Frontiers of Physiology. This particular study is a meta-analysis, meaning it pulls together results from multiple studies to get a clearer picture on what's actually going on. One of the ways it reports its findings is through something called effect sizes. This is just a way of quantifying how meaningful a change is, not just whether or not something worked, but how much it worked. As a rough guide, an effect size of 0.2 is considered small, 0.5 is considered moderate, and anything 0.8 and above is considered a large effect size. I'll come back to some of the specific effect sizes from this paper a little bit later, but that gives you at least a reference point for what those numbers actually mean. The goal of the study was pretty straightforward. They wanted to look at what resistance training actually does for youth athletes, specifically between the ages of about 6 and 18, is what the authors specify, and also look at what variables in training might influence those outcomes. So, this isn't just asking, does it work or are there real risks, but also, how does it work and under what conditions does it work? To do that, they ran a meta analysis, again, pulling together data from over 40 different studies, which through those 40 studies included more than 1,500 young athletes. The first thing that they looked at is the main outcome of resistance training, which is strength. No surprise here, resistance training produced a moderate to large improvement in muscular strength with an average effect size of around 1.0. So, right away, that answers that baseline question. Yes, resistance training does work in youth. And not even just a little bit, like these are meaningful improvements. They dig a little bit deeper and separate the population, specifically children from adolescents. Children, so pre-adolescent athletes, actually showed larger relative improvements in strength gains than adolescents did. Effect sizes in these children were around 1.3 compared to about 0.9 in adolescents. So both significant, but quite a bit higher in the pre-adolescents. So right away, that calls into question the idea that kids just aren't ready for this type of training. That idea doesn't hold up here. If anything, there's evidence suggesting the opposite, that kids are actually even more responsive to resistance training. But an important note here is the mechanism by which those strength gains happens. It's different for pre-adolescents and adolescents. This is very much worth noting. In the younger athletes, these strength gains are driven primarily by neural adaptations, not new muscle growth. Neural adaptation essentially just means more efficient use of existing muscles rather than packing on new muscle tissue. Things like motor unit recruitment, coordination, all contribute to these neural adaptations that we're seeing. After that, the paper expands beyond strength and looks at other performance outcomes. I will say that I don't think anyone will be shocked by these findings that like resistance training makes athletes better. It is nice to have a quantifiable result that we can look at. The authors find that resistance training also improves things like power, so jumping and explosive movements with moderate effects of 0.5 to 0.8, so a little bit less, but still improvement nonetheless. Endurance shows some improvements, it's just smaller and less consistent, and the authors note in the paper that there's just less data available here. Strength is clearly the most robust outcome with an effect size of 1.35 for pre-adolescents and 0.91 for adolescents. But there are broader performance benefits as well to resistance training. From there, the paper shifts into what are called moderator variables. Basically, what aspects of training actually influence the results. And one of the biggest ones is, maybe no surprise, the type of training. Free weight training shows some of the largest effects in the entire analysis, which suggests that exercises that require this extra stabilization from trying to control, say, a dumbbell, exercises that require this coordination and control seem to produce much stronger adaptations than more constrained or this machine-based work. The authors also looked at intensity, frequency, and program duration. Most of the effective programs were running about 2 to 3 sessions per week, typically over a period of 6 to 20 weeks. So it's pretty wide range there. Higher intensities tended to produce better results, but overall, the takeaway is that you don't need anything really extreme. Consistency was key. Structured training is enough to drive a pretty meaningful change. Toward the end of the study, they address safety, although this isn't really the main focus of the paper. That is going to come later in the second supporting paper that I picked. The author's positions are consistent with the broader literature on this. When resistance training is properly supervised and appropriately programmed, it's considered safe for youth and shown to be actually quite effective. They acknowledge that not all resistance training is equal, meaning kids probably shouldn't be following a Mark Ripito powerlifting hypertrophy program, for example. But they also don't need to be sheltered from these once thought evil dumbbells either. They do acknowledge some limitations, which I'm happy to share with this. There's a lot of variability across the studies, so a lot of different exercises, a lot of different populations, and a lot of different training protocols, even. And not all of them cleanly separate this pre and post puberty, the pre adolescence and the adolescence, which makes some of those comparisons a little bit less precise. But even with that variability, the overall pattern, I think, is still pretty clear. Resistance training produces meaningful improvements in strength and performance in youth. And in some cases, the younger athletes, the pre-adolescents, might actually respond better than the older ones. Now, maybe a quick note or a quick backtrack on the point of scientific research, because I'm seeing a major failure of this in a lot of the comments for this Artemis mission. The point with scientific research isn't to go and try and prove something. It's to start with an idea and test it and determine if the evidence supports the idea or not. In fact, a lot of really good detailed science will try to take an idea that somebody has and intentionally try to find evidence that proves it wrong. Most scientific research looks to test a null hypothesis, so sort of the inverse of what the idea is. It's just a good grounded way to get away from any confirmation bias or anything like that, which again, I think is kind of lost in a couple of these pseudoscience groups. So back to this strength training idea. In this case, with the idea that kids should not be doing this type of training, like weights or resistance training, this paper, which is a meta-analysis of a lot of different studies, it just simply doesn't support that idea. I won't say that it proves the myths wrong, because all you need is one case and those myths are not proved wrong. But it does provide evidence that just simply does not support those myths, those ideas that kids should stay away from the gym or that kids should stay away from weights. Now, I have to admit, I originally wanted to have this 2026 paper as the focus of this episode rather than the 2016 paper that I just reviewed. But compared to the Granicher paper, the better fit for the 2026 research was that of a supporting role. The title of it, for those interested, is Impact of Resistance Training Protocols on Muscular Fitness in Pre-Adolescence, a Narrative Review. It was written by Ahmad Bodla from the University of Lahore and published in the journal Advances in Consumer Research just this past February, 2026. This paper zooms in a little bit more on what's actually happening inside the body and some of the broader effects of resistance training, specifically in the pre-adolescent athletes. It circles back to the mechanism behind those strength gains. In the younger athletes, again, as I stated earlier, those improvements in strength are primarily neural adaptations rather than that new muscle tissue. So instead of building a lot of new muscle tissue, what's really happening is the nervous system is getting better at recruiting and coordinating the muscle that's already there. Better motor unit recruitment can facilitate better timing and thus better coordination. Sort of a happy, unintended consequence of strength training youth. This study also addressed that risk of injury again, and the general direction here is that properly structured resistance training is associated with reduced injury risk, not increased injury risk. The mechanism as to why is the body adapts to load through a range of motion. Young athletes show better joint stability, better body control, and better tolerance to working under load. So, not only is the evidence saying resistance training is safe for pre-adolescents, it might actually be injury protective. The paper also touches on some psychological effects and proposes things like increased confidence and engagement in physical activity. I wouldn't lean too heavily on this, but it does point toward resistance training as being something that is likely to support long term participation and not just the short term performance. This 2016 paper then circles back to the big issue, those myths, concerns around growth plates and stunted development and injury risk. The position here is pretty consistent with what is seen elsewhere and more recently in the research. When resistance training is properly supervised and appropriately programmed, there just is not strong evidence supporting those concerns. So, this idea that kids should just stay away from resistance training, which includes dumbbells and weights as the resistance, according to the evidence, it just doesn't hold up. If anything, what the literature is pointing toward is that it's a tool that should actually be introduced earlier, but obviously done properly and with intent and supervised. So, to wrap this up, I think it's worth looking back on where these weightlifting myths might come from. There were a few assumptions driving the myth. One was concerned around these growth plates again, that loading the body during development could interfere with growth. Another was this injury risk, especially in the unsupervised settings where the kids were using equipment improperly. And a big one was hormonal. This idea that because kids don't have the same hormonal profile as adults, that they wouldn't even benefit from resistance training in the first place. The problem with that is those assumptions got carried forward much longer than the evidence supporting them. Across the research, properly structured and supervised resistance training is not associated with growth plate damage or impaired development. The injuries that have been reported are almost always tied to poor supervision or bad technique or loads that just shouldn't have been used in the first place. I'd like to point out that these are all problems that would injure anyone and not just the kids. I've experienced this as an adult doing some powerlifting programs just a couple of years ago, that walking around constantly with a sore back or pulled hip flexor or pulled pec or bicep or something. And even as I've gotten a little bit older, that I'm starting to feel some pain in my joints and my tendons during a lot of these higher lifts. And that's probably just an indication that maybe the lifts are okay, but the load is too much, and it's probably time to just read the body a little bit better and dial things back. That does it for this week's episode. Might turn out to be a little bit shorter, but shorter can be sweeter sometimes too. New episodes are going to drop every Thursday morning at 6 a.m. Mountain Standard Time. You can find these episodes on any of the major podcast platforms, as well as on YouTube at the channel Cortex Goaltender Development. If you would like to support the show, which is currently a one-man operation and does carry some costs associated with it, you can head over to patreon.com/Cortex Athletic Review. There are a couple of different levels of membership there that you can join, and I am slowly working to include more and more rewards with those memberships, so stay tuned for that as I get those up and live. I hope this information was useful. Check the links in the description and the show notes for any socials or to connect. My name is Evan Carrillo. This is the Cortex Athletic Review. Thanks again for listening, and stay out of your own way.